I looked around desperately, trying to find what had made the reflection, when the baby monitor in my hand had turned on again. The laughter was more clear. It was a child laughing and giggling. I dropped the monitor on the floor and darted upstairs towards May's room. More frightened than I had ever been in my entire life, I picked up May and took her to our bedroom. I woke up Matt, attempting to explain what I just heard. He woke up half asleep and went downstairs to check up on it. He came back upstairs a few minutes later, looking at me like I was crazy. He went back to bed and fell asleep immediately after. The next morning, May and I were out front on the porch, enjoying a beautiful day, when our neighbor came over. She looked worn out, nervous, and had black bags under her eyes. She wore pajamas, which were noticeably dirty. I greeted her, asking if she wanted any lemonade, before she interrupted me. She began saying how she hadn't been able to sleep well these past few days because of May's cries at night. I looked at her confused once again, and explained to her that May hadn't been crying at night. She started playing with her hands nervously and began saying that she could hear May screaming and crying every night. When she noticed I wasn't believing what she was telling me, her entire personality changed in an instant. She started yelling out profanity and telling me to, and I quote, "Take your little shit away from here and shut it the fuck up." Feeling threatened, I stood up and went over to May. While picking her up, I told the woman to leave. She stood there looking at May, angry and resentful. She kept yelling at us, startling May as she began to cry. I threatened her with calling the cops and kept telling her to leave before she finally decided to walk off. I went inside the house shaken up, and I felt upset that my neighbor would act in such a way where I felt threatened. I called Matt, asking him to leave work early, explaining what just happened. He immediately left the office and started heading home. As soon as he arrived home, I explained further what our neighbor had said. He became extremely upset. As he held May, we talked about what our neighbor had said regarding May's crying at night. He also didn't understand what our neighbor was talking about. May was a good baby. She hardly gave us any grief. As we were talking, we heard a knock on the door. Thinking that it was our next door neighbor again, Matt gave me May as he went to go see who was knocking. I let out a sigh of relief when our neighbor from across the street came in. Mr. Moss was one of the first friends we made when we moved here. Matt invited him to sit down and offered him something to drink. Mr. Moss politely declined, saying that he came over to talk to us about something very important. Matt and I sat down. I laid May on her swing, giving Mr. Moss my complete attention. He began explaining that earlier that morning, he had seen our next door neighbor come over and start screaming at me. He explained that for a few days now, our neighbor had been acting kinda strange, and he had noticed it when coming home from work. He mentioned that on one particular night, he pulled up to his house after working late and he noticed her outside. She was standing outside in her pajamas on the side of the house while looking up at the window above her. When I asked him for details on the window she was looking up at, he explained that it was the one on the second floor in the right corner of the house. I looked at Matt nervously as Mr. Moss described May's window. Matt held my hands tightly. Mr. Moss went on to explain that after he pulled up to the driveway, he noticed that she wasn't moving. He found it curious that she didn't even look to see what car it was. Not wanting to spook her, in case she hadn't noticed him, he went inside his house to continue some work he still had left. He said that he was working on his laptop for a couple hours before deciding to go to sleep. As he was turning off the lights, he looked out the window, noticing that my neighbor was still standing there staring up. He started fidgeting on the sofa while he spoke to us, as if what he was saying scared him. What he said next frightened me to the point of tears. This time she wasn't standing alone, he said. He saw what seemed to be a little girl standing behind her, looking at her. He estimated the little girl was probably no more than 5 years old. She was wearing a dress and had long black hair. He mentioned that while looking outside his window, he gasped a little, and at that exact moment, the girl slowly turned away from my neighbor and turned her head towards him. He said at that moment he was scared and immediately closed his blinds and laid in bed too frightened to go to sleep. I asked him if he went up to go look again, to which he replied no. Matt and I thanked him as he left the house. We looked at each other deeply concerned about what he just shared. After a few hours of discussion about potentially getting the police involved, Matt got up to use the bathroom. I sat there completely lost in thought when I began hearing the baby monitor from the kitchen again. I stood up and ran to the kitchen. I stared at it while the familiar static slowly cleared to laughter. I picked up the monitor and ran towards the bathroom, pressing it firmly against the door, yelling at Matt to come out. He opened the door, asking what was wrong. When he stopped to hear the laughter playing on the monitor, I gave the baby monitor to him as we ran upstairs to May's room. We had put her to sleep upstairs after she passed out on her swing. We ran inside her room, nervous and scared. When we saw that she still lay there, sleeping in her crib, we looked at each other confused. The monitor he was holding suddenly went silent from the static. I stared at it before turning it around and shutting it off. We stood there in silence, attempting to rationalize what just happened, when the monitor in our bedroom turned on and began letting out that same laughter we just heard. The door was open and the baby monitor stood on my nightstand. Matt and I could see it clearly from May's room. The laughter got louder and louder as it suddenly started playing on all three monitors. I picked up May, scared and crying at the same time. Matt held me as he dropped the monitor he was holding. The laughter went from child's laughter to something that sounded completely demonic. Right as we began running out of the room, the voice let out one last piercing scream. It screamed cry. As soon as it said that, we heard a gunshot that sounded like it came from next door. May woke up and began crying at the chaos in her room. Matt and I were getting ready to make a run for it when the laughter suddenly stopped. We ran out as fast as we could. Other neighbors started coming out of their homes, getting ready to investigate the gunshot. We bumped into Mr. Moss, waiting for the police to arrive, when two men decided to go inside our next door neighbor's house to investigate. After a few minutes, one immediately came running out yelling, "We need an ambulance!" After about an hour of standing outside, Matt and I were still too afraid to go back inside for our car keys. We waited outside among all the police officers and Mr. Moss, hoping to overhear what had happened. A short stubby lady that lived a few houses down came up to us explaining that she just overheard one of the men who had gone in to investigate. She said that the men found our next door neighbor's body sitting in a chair, looking directly out the window with a gunshot wound in her head. I stood there stunned to hear that she decided to take her own life. When the lady continued speaking, she said that the gun was on the second floor and that she had cuts all over her arms which seemed to be self-inflicted. She went on to explain, directly behind her on the wall, she had spelt out, "She won't stop crying," in her own blood. Matt and I left the majority of things at that house. We moved across the country and kept in contact with only Mr. Moss over the years. We wanted to leave everything behind us and start a new life with May. Nothing paranormal happened to us for years, and we were perfectly happy to move on. May is now 5 years old. She's a brilliant, curious, happy, and a loving child. Matt needed a few things from our storage this week and brought some old boxes home. This morning, May came into the kitchen, excited and attempting to get my attention as I was putting away the dishes. I had my back turned on her as she kept repeating, "Mama, girl, she's funny. Mama, she's laughing." I finally turned around thinking that she was talking about her playdate next door when I dropped the plate I was holding on the floor. The plate shattered on the floor, as did my heart when I saw what my little girl was holding up next to her ear. May was holding up one of the old baby monitors from the old house, and on it, I could hear a child's laughter.